Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing valvular heart disease. Okay, so we've now gone over the anatomy of the four heart valves, the tricuspid valve, the pulmonary valve, the mitral valve and the aortic valve, and I now want to actually turn our attention to the topic of the video, which is valvular heart disease. So if you like, we've now finished the introductory stuff and we're ready to actually take on the major topic of this video. So, for valvular heart disease then, for each of these four heart valves, the tricuspid valve, the pulmonary valve, the mitral valve and the aortic valve, there are fundamentally two things that can go wrong with each of those four valves, which are stenosis and regurgitation. And to begin with then, I want to talk about what it means for each one of these four heart valves to become stenotic and what it means for each one of these four heart valves to start regurgitating. And you can probably guess already, but I will spell it out. Then after that, what we'll do is we'll go over the heart murmurs, which are the sounds that you will hear upon auscultation to the heart if you have valvular heart disease in any one of the four heart valves. So if any one of the four heart valves is either stenotic or regurgitating, you'll hear a special sound on auscultation, a strange sound, rather than the normal two heart sounds, and that's called a heart murmur. So we'll go through the different types of heart murmurs resulting from valvular heart disease. After that, we will then discuss the consequences of valvular heart disease and the major consequences that the heart no longer functions properly and therefore you get heart failure, so we'll go over heart failure. And then finally, we will go on to the actual pathological processes that can lead to any one of these four heart valves becoming stenotic or regurgitating. And we've got 6 different pathological processes to go through. We've got calcification, we've got rheumatic heart disease, infective endocarditis, myxomatosis degeneration, Libman-Sacks endocarditis, and carcinoid heart disease. So that's just a review again of the structure that we're going to follow from here on in. So the first thing then I want to discuss is the fact that fundamentally each one of these four heart valves can either become stenotic or regurgitate. So let me put a little title here. So I'll put the title VHD for valvular heart disease abbreviation. And fundamentally, each one of the four heart valves can become one of two things. It can either develop stenosis, so you can either get heart valve stenosis, or you can get heart valve regurgitation. So let me now discuss what these actually mean. So we'll start with stenosis. So they're the utter opposite problems, effectively. Stenosis means that the heart valve is not going to open properly. So this means that the heart valve no longer opens properly. So if the heart valve is stenosed, it doesn't open properly, so not opening properly. So let me give you an example. So let's take the example of the aortic valve, and let's talk about what aortic stenosis would entail. So here's the aortic valve. If the aortic valve was stenosed, if you had aortic stenosis, what it would mean is that when the left ventricle contracts, so when the left ventricle contracts and forces blood up and pushes open the aortic valve, so the aortic valve cusps move upwards and you open up this gap in between the cusps, that maximum gap that you open in the aortic valve is reduced. Okay, it's narrowed. That's what stenosis fundamentally means. It means narrowing. So, for one reason or another, and we'll go over the reasons later on, the valve cusps do not move as much as they should, and they don't open as wide a gap, a wider space in between them, and therefore the outlet for blood from the left ventricle into the aorta is stenosed. That is what it means for a heart valve to be stenosed. It doesn't open properly, it doesn't open as wide a hole for the blood to move through as it should. Instead, it opens a narrower hole. And that, of course, means that it's very difficult for the chamber to actually push the blood through that valve, more difficult than it should be. So the left ventricle is going to have a difficult job pushing blood for a stenosed aortic valve. And it's not just the aortic valve which can become stenosed, all of them in principle can become stenosed. In practice, it's very rare for some of them to become stenosed. Aortic valve stenosis is the most common, but in principle, all of them could become stenosed. So you could get tricuspid stenosis, and that would mean that the tricuspid valve, when it opens, it doesn't open that wide, it doesn't open as wide as it should, so the right atrium is going to have a big problem pushing blood into the right ventricle. You could have pulmonary valve stenosis, which would mean that the pulmonary valve doesn't open as wide as it should, and therefore the right ventricle will have an incredibly difficult time pushing blood into the pulmonary trunk. You could have mitral valve stenosis, and that would mean that the left atrium would have a very difficult time ejecting blood into the left ventricle, and finally you could have aortic valve stenosis. Okay, so that's what it means for a heart valve to become stenotic. And no prizes for guessing what it means for a heart valve to become regurgitating. So, stenosis is a problem with opening, regurgitation is a problem with not closing properly. So regurgitation is not closing properly. So if the heart valve doesn't close properly, then you get regurgitation. The blood will go back the wrong way. So again, let's take the example of aortic regurgitation. So in this example, what will happen is now, for one reason or another, and we'll go over the reasons later, the heart valve is no longer going to actually seal the outlet properly. So when the left ventricle has relaxed back down, what should happen, of course, is the cusps should go back down and they should close up the gap, and therefore no blood can come from the aorta back into the left ventricle. If it doesn't close properly, it doesn't close that outlet properly, then you can get blood coming from the aorta back into the left ventricle, and that will be called aortic regurgitation. Equivalently, you can have regurgitation of the other three heart valves as well. So tricuspid regurgitation would involve the tricuspid valve not closing properly, there's still being gaps there, and when you've got right ventricular systole, when the right ventricle is contracting, you might then get blood going back into the right atrium because that tricuspid valve hasn't closed the gap properly. In pulmonary valve regurgitation, then the pulmonary valve wouldn't close properly, and when the right ventricle relaxes, you'd get blood coming back from the pulmonary trunk into the right ventricle. In mitral valve regurgitation, when the left atrium relaxes, you'll get blood coming from the left ventricle back into the left atrium. Again, this is going to lead to problems with the heart pumping blood around the body, and that's fundamentally what all forms of valvular heart disease overall result in: the heart not performing its function properly, and therefore heart failure developing, but we'll talk about that more later on. So those are the two major things that can happen to each of the four heart valves, and we will discuss all the different pathological processes that can lead to a heart valve becoming stenosed or regurgitating later on, because there are many of those. But these fundamentally are the two practical things that can actually happen to a valve. It can either get diseased and no longer open properly, or it can get diseased and not close properly. Right. So let's now go on to discussing the heart murmurs, and this is a really important clinical topic. So we'll do this here, I think. So I might put a full title, actually. I'll put heart murmurs rather than just murmurs. So heart murmurs. So as I said earlier, these are funny sounds that you will hear when you auscultate a heart which has valvular heart disease. They sound different from the normal sounds of the heart, the normal first and second heart sounds. So the first thing that we need to discuss, if we're going to go over heart murmurs then, is what does the heart normally sound like on auscultation? Well, normally on auscultation you just hear two sounds. You hear the lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. That's what the heart normally sounds like. Now, I think the best way to understand heart murmurs is to draw little diagrams of the sound. Now remember, sound is a fluctuation in air pressure, so the way that you can actually draw little graphs of sound is you can have the x-axis being time, so this is going to be time, and then the y-axis is going to be pressure, so air pressure. And when you hear a sound, you'll get a little fluctuation in air pressure. So usually this is what you hear when you listen to the heart with a stethoscope. So you should hear something like this. Here is one heart sound, okay, a little fluctuation in the air pressure, and then shortly after you'll get the next heart sound, and then you'll have a gap, and then the next heart beat will come. and there's the first heart sound again, and we're off the page now. I could continue it on, so I might, just for the purposes of completion, do another one. So there's the first heart sound, here's the second heart sound, and then you've got another gap. So, labelling these up, this is the first heart sound, S1, this is the second heart sound, S2, this is another beat of the heart, this is S1, and this is S2. And let me just remind you what the heart sounds actually represent. The first heart sound represents the closing of the atrioventricular valve. So let's just remember back to our cardiac cycle over here. So here is my old picture of the cardiac cycle. Remember, you start with atrial systole, that pushes the blood from the right atrium and the left atrium into the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Okay, then you get atrial diastole, and then the atrioventricular valves close. So the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve close. That first heart sound is the sound of the atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid and mitral valves closing, slamming shut. They create that first heart sound. Then you get ventricular systole, so the right ventricle and the left ventricle contract. Of course, at that point, the semilunar valves will be open, then ventricular diastole, and then the semilunar valves will close, so the pulmonary and aortic valve will close. The sound of the semilunar valves closing is then the second heart sound. So the heart sounds are made by the semilunar valves closing. So back to this picture over here, let's just write that down. So S1, or the first heart sound, this is due to the AV valves closing, and that occurs right at the end of atrial, it occurs at the end of atrial systole, at the beginning of atrial diastole, i.e. just before ventricular systole occurs. So actually it's very useful to think of this as the start of ventricular systole. So the first heart sound marks the start of ventricular systole. So ventricular systole starts here. Whereas the second heart sound, we know what that means. The second heart sound, this is the semilunar valves closing. So semilunar valves closing. And of course that will occur at the end of ventricular systole, because they close once the ventricles have relaxed back down, and now the blood is trying to move back from the arterial systems into the ventricles. So actually, this portion here, the bit between the two heart sounds, between S1 and S2, this is ventricular systole, so I'll call it just VS, and the bit in between the second heart sound and the next first heart sound, this is ventricular diastole, VD. Okay, so this is the normal sound of the heart, so I'll just go through it. Lub, and then a little gap, dub, and then a bigger gap, and then the next beat of the heart, lub, dub. So this little oscillation in pressure, this is what is a sound. That's what sound is. It's a fluctuation in air pressure. So when you hear a short, when you've got this short little fluctuation in air pressure here, that sounds like a clipped little sound, like dub. Okay? Right. Now let's discuss how this will be altered if you've got valvular heart disease. So we can cluster this together. You might think we're going to now have to go through 8 different scenarios. We're going to have to go through all of the 4 different heart valves, and for each we're going to have to go through stenosis and regurgitation. Well, it's not quite as much work as that, because actually they come in pairs that sound exactly the same. You see, if you have aortic and pulmonary stenosis, let's say, those are going to sound actually the same. Think about it, because remember, the right ventricle and left ventricle are contracting at the same time, and both the pulmonary and aortic valves, they are going to be being used at the same time. So if they're both stenosed, the sound that's going to create, the murmur that's going to create, will be the same. So actually we can group them together. So we can group aortic and pulmonary stenosis together, aortic and pulmonary regurgitation together. We can group mitral and tricuspid stenosis together, and mitral and tricuspid regurgitation together. Okay, so let's now go through this. So I think we will actually start with aortic and pulmonary stenosis. I think that's a nice dramatic one to start with. Okay, so let's go create a little bit more space. So I'm trying to go to a more organised place. I think we'll go down here. This looks like a good place to go. Okay, right, so we're now going to do aortic or pulmonary stenosis, and as I say, they're going to sound reasonably the same. So we're going to do aortic / pulmonary stenosis. So you've either got aortic stenosis or pulmonary stenosis, and of those two, aortic stenosis is the far more common. Overall, it's far more common for you to get valvular heart disease on the left heart than in the right heart, just because the left heart's under so much more strain than the right heart. The pressures in the left heart are so much higher than in the right heart, and those high pressures mean that the heart valves are more likely to get damaged. Okay, so let's think about how this is actually going to disturb what we're going to hear. So the aortic and pulmonary valve is stenosed. This means that when we have ventricular systole, which is this portion of the heart sound cycle here, we're going to be forcing blood into either the aorta or the pulmonary for a stenosed gap. Now that's going to create noise. When you force blood for a narrow gap, that creates noise. And it's going to create a noise in this portion of the cycle here, because of course it's going to be present during ventricular systole, because that's when blood is going to be being ejected into either the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. So this is actually what you get. So I'm going to just effectively draw out exactly the same picture here, but now what it would look like for aortic and pulmonary stenosis. So we start with the first heart sound, which is the atrioventricular valves closing, and then of course ventricular systole starts. And now blood is going to be forced into either the aorta or pulmonary trunk for a stenosed heart valve, and what you actually get is a sound like this. It gets gradually bigger and bigger disturbances, and then it goes down towards the end. So as you're reaching the peak of ventricular systole, where the pressure's the highest and you're getting highest rate of flow through the stenosed valve, you get the loudest sound due to that. And then it goes back down, and then the second heart sound of the semilunar valves closing is just swallowed up by this. So this is what you now get, and you can see that it's no longer distinguishable, the S1 and the S2, they're part of this great big murmur now. Okay, so you're not going to hear lub-dub anymore, because they're part of this, and the way the brain hears this is very different from lub-dub, lub-dub. Instead, the way the brain will hear this sort of a disturbance in air pressure is like so. Okay, so it gets louder and louder as, obviously, I am presuming you know a little bit about sound. As the disturbances in pressure get bigger and bigger, that's a louder sound. So it starts off quiet, and then it gets louder, and then it goes down quieter again. So it's like this. And I hope you can hear that on the recording. Okay, so we have descriptions for this type of murmur. So it's called a mid-systolic murmur. Now what does this mean? Well, systolic is referring to ventricular systole. The mid means that it's reaching a peak, it's at its highest during the middle of systole. So it's a mid-systolic, and then there's another fancy description of it. Crescendo, decrescendo murmur. Now, unless you are a fan of music, you will have absolutely no idea what crescendo and decrescendo meant. I had absolutely no idea what a crescendo and a decrescendo was until I learned about heart murmurs. But if you are musical, you will know that a crescendo means the part of the sound where it's getting louder. So this is the crescendo part here, where the sound's getting louder. So that's the crescendo, and then the decrescendo is obviously it getting quieter again. So that's the. So overall, it's a crescendo, decrescendo murmur, because you go for a crescendo and then you go for a decrescendo. So this is a crescendo, decrescendo murmur. So I'll hiss it out again. So instead of being which is the normal heart sounds, that's S1 and S2, instead you get okay, and it tails off like that, and then you'll get it again. So this is what the heart will sound like. It's quite fun making these sounds. Instead of what it would normally sound is that's what it should sound like, the lub-dub, lub-dub. Okay, so that is what we would call a mid-systolic crescendo-decrescendo murmur, and this will occur if you have either aortic stenosis or pulmonary stenosis. And I hope you understand why both of those will give the same murmur here, so we can group them together. Right, next murmur along. So we'll stick with the aortic and pulmonary valves, but we'll now go on to what would regurgitation of the aortic or pulmonary valve sound like. So we'll now do aortic pulmonary regurgitation. I'm going to have to get some new colours. It's getting incredibly boring when I just go for white, yellow, and that strange green colour. So regurgitation. Okay, right. Okay, so let me get another colour. We will do it in blue. So let's think about this. So the aortic or pulmonary valve is regurgitating this time. It's not stenosed, it's regurgitating. Now, where will regurgitation occur? Well, it's not going to occur in ventricular systole, because in ventricular systole, blood is being chucked out of the right ventricle and the left ventricle into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, respectively. So in fact, it's going to occur in ventricular diastole. So once the ventricles have gone into relaxation, this is where we're now going to get blood coming back from either the aorta into the left ventricle or from the pulmonary trunk into the right ventricle. So this is going to occur in this bit. We're going to get a murmur here in the early diastole period. And in fact, this is one of the descriptions that we give of the murmur associated with aortic or pulmonary regurgitation. We call it an early diastolic murmur, and this is just quite simply telling us that it's going to occur in the early diastole period of this sound cycle here. Okay, so let me draw out what you'll get. So you will get the first heart sound, absolutely fine, so okay, that's fine. And now here is ventricular systole, and then it changes when we go on to the second heart sound. So here's the second heart sound, but now you're not just going to have a flat line after that. Instead, you're going to get a whole racket here. And what you're actually going to get is a decrescendo racket. So it will gradually get smaller and smaller, and then it will go to a flat line. And I hope you understand why, because when ventricular diastole has just started, that's where the flow backwards will be highest, because that's where the pressure difference is the highest. As diastole continues, it will tail off because the pressure difference is getting smaller and smaller. So we're getting a decrescendo murmur here. So this is the description. It's an early diastolic decrescendo because the loudness is getting lower. So it's an early diastolic decrescendo murmur. So let me now try and actually make this sound. So what you'll get is, and then as the next one, you won't just get another, instead you'll get like that. So you'll get, and I hope I'm communicating the decrescendo there. If I do it louder, it gets less loud as it tails off. So doing it once more, instead of, which is what the heart should sound like. Okay, so that's aortic / pulmonary regurgitation and what that will sound like. And again, I hope you understand why it's going to sound like that. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. So we're off the aortic and pulmonary valves now. We've been through all of the 4 different options there. So let's now go to the tricuspid and mitral valves. So again, we can group these together. So we'll start off again with tricuspid or mitral stenosis, and then we'll do regurgitation. So tricuspid / mitral stenosis. So think about this. Try and come up with what you think it's going to be before I tell you. So in this one, what's happening? The tricuspid or the mitral valve is stenosed. So that means that in atrial systole, you're going to get a murmur because now you're going to be forcing blood through a stenosed atrioventricular valve. That will create noise. That will create a murmur on my little graph. Now, where is atrial systole? Well, it is in front of the first heart sound, because remember the first heart sound is the atrioventricular valves closing, so that's the end of atrial systole. So it's actually in this portion of the cycle. It's not here, remember, that's the end of ventricular systole, and there will be a period where you've got both ventricular diastole and atrial diastole. It's only right at the end of ventricular diastole where the atria start to go into systole. Well, actually, sorry, it's a little bit earlier than just the end. It's more in the midpoint here, and in fact, we're going to see a murmur from the mid sort of part of the ventricular diastole period to the start of the first heart sound, and this murmur is indeed described as a mid-diastolic murmur. Okay, so let me now go over that. So, how am I going to show this here? So, I'm drawing the same picture as always, and now we're going to have a murmur in this bit here. So, just before S1, from the mid portion of ventricular diastole, you're going to get a murmur like this. And it is a murmur that remains sort of at level. It's not quite like aortic and pulmonary stenosis. Remember, the ventricles contract with much more force than the atria. So they really do pump the blood out at a very fast rate in the middle. So you get this decrescendo, decrescendo. In the case of tricuspid and mitral stenosis, the atria are quite weak. So rather than getting a crescendo, decrescendo, you just get a constant sort of murmur like this. And that swallows the first heart sound. So this contains the portion of sound that's coming because you're forcing blood through the stenosed tricuspid or mitral valve, and then it contains the first heart sound. So I might just put that on here. So this is the first heart sound. And in fact, just to complete up the other pictures, I'll just put in the fact that here would be S1, here would be the second heart sound. They're just part of the murmur now. You don't hear them as distinct sounds because they're part of this noise here. So they're part of the murmur. The brain doesn't hear them as distinct sounds anymore. And you've got to have that basic understanding of how the brain interprets sound to understand that. Okay, and on this blue one here, this is obviously the first heart sound, and you still hear that as the first heart sound, but you don't hear the second heart sound anymore, and that's because that oscillation in pressure is just swallowed into the murmur, and because it's no longer a clipped little oscillation, you don't hear it as a clipped little sound anymore. You hear it as a long, drawn-out oscillation in air pressure, this muffly, murmury sound. Okay, and the same is going to happen here in the tricuspid / mitral stenosis. So S1 has been swallowed, and then you'll get, ventricular systole will be absolutely fine, it's normal. Unfortunately, I've messed it up, so let me just rub this out now. And do that again. Here we go. So ventricular systole is absolutely normal, and then you've got the second heart sound, that's fine, and then you've got the break, and then again in mid-diastole you're going to start getting the murmur from atrial contraction and pushing blood for a stenosed tricuspid or mitral valve. Okay, so this is S2 here. So the description of this is it's a mid-diastolic murmur. And it's a level murmur, so you don't call it a crescendo or decrescendo or anything like that. So you just call it a mid-diastolic murmur. So let me actually make this sound now. So what you're going to get is it will start off with a, and that's not crescendo, decrescendo, so it's just the same loudness all the time. So just like that sound, that classical sound of a television receiving noise, the noise of, when you've not actually got a picture and it's just muffling, picking up background radiation or whatever. A physicist would know far better than me. So it's, and then, instead of, so the first heart sound is instead replaced by this long that's just level. It's not crescendo, decrescendo. Okay, so that's tricuspid mitral stenosis and the mid-diastolic murmur that it creates. Finally, let's do tricuspid or mitral regurgitation. So tricuspid / mitral regurgitation. And again, be thinking, and this is all really logical. I love this stuff. It makes complete sense. And you can work out exactly what the murmurs are going to sound like once you understand. So try and think what the murmur is going to sound like in the case of tricuspid / mitral regurgitation. And I'll just move this up a little bit so that it's easier for me to write it on. Okay, right. So, in tricuspid or mitral regurgitation, when the ventricles contract, you're now going to get blood regurgitating into the atria. That will create a noise again. So, back up to this picture here. Ventricular systole is this period here. Excuse me a second, my phone is ringing. Okay, sorry about that. Right, so where were we? We were discussing mitral and tricuspid regurgitation. So, in ventricular systole here, between the first and second heart sounds, you're going to get a noise because blood from the ventricles is regurgitating into the atria. So you're going to get a murmur in this period here. Okay, so let's go down and draw a picture of this. So tricuspid mitral regurgitation. So this is what you'll see. So S1's going to be, well, the period in front of S1 is going to be fine. Then you'll have S1 here. So here's S1. And that's the atrioventricular valves closing, but then you're now going to get regurgitation from the ventricles into the atria when the ventricles contract. So you're going to get oscillation in the pressure like so, and then you'll get the second heart sound that will just become part of the murmur here, like so. So I'll demarcate them out. So here's the first heart sound, and here's the second heart sound. And remember, the second heart sound is then the end of ventricular systole, where the semilunar valves are closing. So then the regurgitation into the atria will stop because no longer is the pressure high in the ventricles, so you won't get blood moving back into the atria after that. And then you'll have it going on, and then you'll have the next one along, and it will be just like this again. So both of the heart sounds get consumed into this oscillation here, which is the murmur, and it's not crescendo decrescendo, it's just constant. So all you hear is each of those is a heartbeat, and this is described as a pansystolic murmur because it goes across the entire of systole. So this is the pansystolic murmur. So pan means entire, and systolic refers to ventricular systole, so it's going throughout the entire of systole, pansystole. Okay, right, so that's the pansystolic murmur of tricuspid or mitral regurgitation. And I'd just like to summarise that one because I realise that my phone going off has distracted my attention somewhat. So, in tricuspid mitral regurgitation, when the ventricles contract, you're going to get blood moving back into the atria. Either, if we're talking about the tricuspid regurgitation, you'll get it moving from the right ventricle into the right atrium, or mitral regurgitation, you'll get it moving from the left ventricle back into the left atrium. That movement creates a noise, it creates oscillations, okay, which will be seen as a murmur. So starting at S1, you're going to have continuous oscillations between S1 and S2. So for the entire of systole, you have this murmur, and it swallows the first and second heart sounds, so you no longer hear those as distinct sounds. Instead, you just hear a continuous noise. So you hear, and it doesn't crescendo or decrescendo. It's very different from aortic / pulmonary stenosis, which is, this is, and then next heartbeat, and then next heartbeat, and then next heartbeat, instead of the normal. Okay, and that's described as a pansystolic murmur. So these are the 4 different types of murmur. The mid-systolic crescendo-decrescendo murmur, which occurs because of aortic or pulmonary stenosis, that's okay. The early diastolic decrescendo murmur, which occurs because of aortic or pulmonary regurgitation, that's the mid-diastolic murmur that occurs because of tricuspid or mitral stenosis, that's okay? And the pansystolic murmur that occurs because of tricuspid or mitral regurgitation, that's just etc. Okay, so those are the sounds that you will hear on auscultation with a stethoscope if someone has valvular heart disease, and they're known as the heart murmurs. Okay, so we will have a break here. I will see who it was that was actually calling me, and in the next video we will move on to the consequences of valvular heart disease, and we will discuss heart failure.